Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead and stared at the broken water recycler with tired eyes. The machine had been making strange noises for 3 days before it finally gave up and died completely. Now it sat silent in the corner of his equipment shed, useless as a pile of scrap metal. Jake kicked the base of the machine and immediately regretted it when pain shot through his toe. Cursing under his breath, he limped back to his ranch house and checked the emergency water tanks one more time. The numbers had not changed since the last time he looked. 14 days of water left, maybe less if he was being honest with himself. The planet Kepler 442b had seemed like a dream when Jake first arrived 7 years ago. Earth was dying, drowning in its own pollution and choked by overpopulation. The colonial program offered hope, a chance to start fresh on a new world that could support human life. They called it the New Frontier, comparing it to the American West of centuries past. Jake had liked that comparison. His great-great-grandfather had been a rancher in Montana, and Jake had always felt like he was born in the wrong time. When the chance came to homestead on an alien world, he jumped at it without thinking twice. The reality of Kepler 442b was harder than the recruitment videos had shown. The planet was beautiful in its own way, with red dust that covered everything and vast open spaces that stretched to the horizon, but it was also harsh and unforgiving. Water was scarce, carefully managed by the colony's recycling systems. The native plants were toxic to Earth animals, so everything had to be grown in controlled environments or imported at great cost. The weather was unpredictable, with dust storms that could last for weeks and bury entire buildings under meters of fine red sand. And then there were the Yavani people. The indigenous inhabitants of Kepler 442b were humanoid but clearly not human. Their copper-colored skin had a slight shimmer in the sunlight, and their eyes were larger than human eyes, adapted to the planet's dimmer sun. They were nomadic, moving through the vast canyon systems that cut through the planet's surface like veins. The colonial charter required humans to maintain a respectful distance from the Yavani, and most colonists were happy to obey that rule. There had been incidents in the early years, misunderstandings that turned violent. People had died on both sides, and the tension between the two species remained thick as mud. Jake's ranch sat 5 miles from the main colony settlement of New Mesa. He preferred the isolation, liked being able to work without neighbors watching his every move. He raised cattle, genetically modified earth cows that could survive on less water and tolerate the alien grasses that grew in certain valleys. It was not easy work, and it was not particularly profitable, but it was his, and that meant everything to him. Most nights he sat on his porch and looked up at the unfamiliar stars and felt more at home than he ever had on Earth. But now, staring at his dwindling water supply, Jake felt fear creeping into his gut. The repair parts for the recycler were coming from Earth, shipped on a cargo vessel that was still weeks away. The colony's main water processing plant was working, but it was operating at half capacity, and priority went to the residential areas. Outlying ranches like Jake's were on their own until the situation improved. He had sent a message to the colony administrator explaining his situation, but the response had been brief and unhelpful. Ration carefully and wait for the supply ship. Jake walked outside and checked on his cattle. The animals were clustered near the water trough, their modified biology keeping them alive but their eyes showing the stress of reduced rations. He had already cut their water by 1/3, and he knew he would have to cut it more in the coming days. Some of the cows might not make it, but that was the cost of survival out here. Everything was a calculation, a balance between what you had and what you needed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that never failed to take Jake's breath away. He was about to head inside when he noticed something near the southern fence line, a dark shape that had not been there that morning. Jake grabbed his binoculars and focused on the object. His heart began to pound when he realized it was a person, lying motionless in the red dust. Jake ran to his utility vehicle and drove across the rough terrain, the vehicle bouncing over rocks and small dunes. As he got closer, he could see that the person was small, probably young, and wearing the traditional woven garments of the Yavani people. Jake stopped the vehicle and approached on foot, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. The Yavani were not generally hostile, but a scared or injured person could be unpredictable. The girl was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, the unmistakable signs of severe dehydration. Jake checked for other injuries but found none. She had simply been out in the heat too long without water. He looked around, searching for any sign of her tribe or family, but the landscape was empty in all directions. The girl was alone and dying. Jake knew the rules about contact with the Yavani. He knew the penalties for violating the charter, but he also knew that he could not leave a child to die in the dust. He lifted her carefully and carried her to the vehicle. She was lighter than he expected, her body thin and fragile. As he drove back to the ranch, Jake's mind was already doing the calculations. She would need water, a lot of it, to recover from this level of dehydration. He would have to give up at least 3 days of his own rations, maybe more. That would leave him with 11 days of water, possibly less. The supply ship was still 30 days away at minimum. Jake carried the girl inside and laid her on his bed. He wet a cloth with precious water and dabbed at her cracked lips. Her eyes fluttered but did not open. He knew he should contact the colony, report the situation, maybe arrange for medical transport. But he also knew that would take hours, and the girl might not have hours. Sometimes the right choice was also the simple choice. Jake filled a cup with water and began the slow process of getting the unconscious girl to drink. The girl woke up fighting. One moment she was lying still on Jake's bed, and the next moment she was swinging her fists and trying to kick anyone within reach. Jake barely managed to dodge a surprisingly strong kick aimed at his head. He stepped back quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm, and started speaking in the few Yavani words he knew. The phrases were basic trading terms, things like peace and friend and safe, learned from the cultural guides that the colony provided to all settlers. The girl stopped struggling and stared at him with wide, suspicious eyes. She was young, probably around 15 Earth years if Jake was guessing correctly. Her copper skin had regained some color, and her eyes, though still showing fear, were alert and focused. She said something in rapid Yavani that Jake could not understand. He shook his head and tried again with his limited vocabulary, pointing to the water cup and then to her and making drinking motions. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by shame. Among the Yavani people, as Jake had learned from the cultural guides, accepting help from strangers created a debt that had to be repaid. The girl looked around the room, taking in the human technology and furniture, clearly trying to figure out where she was and how she had gotten there. Jake pointed to himself and said his name slowly. The girl hesitated, then placed her hand over her heart in what Jake recognized as a Yavani gesture of introduction. She said something that sounded like Kiona. Over the next hour, Jake and Kiona communicated through gestures and the handful of words they shared between them. Jake showed her the water recycler, or what was left of it, and tried to explain that it was broken. He showed her the emergency tanks and made it clear through pointing and simple drawings that the water supply was limited. Kiona seemed to understand. She looked at the water gauge for a long time, then at Jake, and something shifted in her expression. Jake made her drink more water. Even though every cup he gave her was a cup he would not have for himself later, she needed it more than he did right now, and arguing with himself about the logic of that would not change his decision. He had made his choice when he picked her up from the dust, and he was not the kind of man who second-guessed himself once a decision was made. On the second day, Kiona was stronger. She could walk around the ranch house without getting dizzy, and her lips were healing. Jake gave her more water, along with some of his food rations. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and Jake realized she had probably been starving as well as dehydrated. He wondered what had happened to her, how she had ended up alone in the desert so far from the canyon lands where her people lived. But without a common language he could not ask, and she did not volunteer the information. Jake showed Kiona around the ranch, partly to give her something to do and partly because he was curious about how she would react to human methods of farming and ranching. She watched the cattle with interest, approaching them carefully and making soft clicking sounds that seemed to calm the animals. She examined the irrigation systems and the solar panels that powered Jake's equipment. Everything was new to her, but she did not seem frightened by the technology, just curious. On the third day, Jake's water supply had dropped to 7 days. He had been rationing his own consumption heavily, giving Kiona what she needed to fully recover. His mouth was dry and he felt the beginning stages of dehydration creeping into his body, but he had been through worse. He could last 7 more days easily, especially if he stayed inside during the hottest parts of the day and minimized physical activity. Kiona spent most of the 3rd day watching Jake work. He repaired a fence that had been damaged in the last storm, checked the cattle for signs of illness, and tried one more time to fix the water recycler even though he knew it was hopeless without replacement parts. Every so often he would look up and find Kiona studying him with an expression he could not read. It made him uncomfortable being watched so intently, but he did not ask her to stop. In the evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in its usual spectacular colors, Kiona approached Jake on the porch. She had regained her full strength, and she moved with the fluid grace that seemed natural to all Yavani people. She stood in front of Jake and placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward him in a gesture he did not recognize. She spoke in Yavani, the words flowing like music, and even though Jake could not understand them, he could hear the emotion behind them. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else. A promise, maybe, or a vow. Jake nodded, not knowing what else to do. Kiona smiled, and for the first time since she woke up, she looked truly at peace. She said one more thing, a single word that Jake thought might be remember or debt in Yavani, and then she turned and walked toward the southern fence line. Jake watched her go, resisting the urge to call her back or offer her supplies for the journey. She was Yavani, and they were desert people who knew how to survive in harsh conditions better than any human colonist. She would make it back to her tribe or she would not, but that was beyond Jake's control now. He watched until she disappeared into the gathering darkness, becoming just another shadow among the rocks and red dunes. Then he went inside and checked his water gauge one more time. 7 days. The supply ship was still 3 weeks away at minimum, possibly 4 if there were delays. Jake did the math in his head and did not like the answer. He was going to run out of water long before help arrived. He could try to make the journey to New Mesa and beg for extra rations from the colony's emergency supplies. But that would mean abandoning his cattle and his ranch for at least 2 days, and there was no guarantee the colony would help him. Resources were tight everywhere, and ranchers who lived outside the main settlement were expected to be self-sufficient. That was part of the deal when you chose to homestead in the frontier. Jake poured himself a small cup of water and sat by the window, looking out at the alien landscape that he had grown to love. He thought about Kiona and hoped she would make it home safely. He thought about his cattle and his ranch and all the work he had put into building a life on this strange planet. He thought about the water gauge and the ticking clock and the simple fact that sometimes doing the right thing came with a cost. He drank the water slowly, making it last, and settled in to wait for whatever came next. The storm appeared on the horizon on day 9, a massive wall of red dust that stretched from the ground to the upper atmosphere. Jake had seen plenty of dust storms during his 7 years on Kepler 442b, but this one looked different. It was darker, thicker, and it was moving fast. He checked the weather monitor in his ranch house and felt his stomach drop when he saw the readings. Wind speeds over 100 kilometers per hour, visibility near zero, duration estimated at 3 to 5 days minimum. Jake immediately began storm preparations. He moved the cattle into the barn and sealed all the ventilation systems except for the filtered air intakes. He brought in all his tools and equipment from the yard, anything that could be picked up and turned into a projectile by the high winds. He double-checked the seals on all the windows and doors, then activated the emergency shields that would protect the glass from being sand-blasted into oblivion. All of this was standard procedure, things he had done dozens of times before. What was not standard was his water situation. Jake checked the gauge and saw that he had exactly 5 days of water left. He had been rationing heavily, drinking barely enough to stay functional, and giving the cattle the absolute minimum they needed to survive. Some of the weaker animals were already showing serious signs of distress. If the storm lasted the full 5 days that the weather monitor predicted, Jake would run out of water while still trapped inside with no way to call for help or reach the colony. The storm hit 2 hours after Jake finished his preparations. One moment there was eerie calm, the kind of stillness that comes before major weather events. And the next moment the world disappeared into a screaming red chaos. The wind hammered against the ranch house, making the walls shake and the roof creak. Dust found its way through every tiny crack and gap. coating everything in a fine red powder. The emergency shields over the windows turned opaque under the assault of sand and debris. Jake sat in his living room and listened to the storm rage outside. He had a single lamp on, running off the backup battery system since the solar panels were useless in the perpetual darkness of the storm. The cattle were bellowing in the barn, frightened by the noise and the shaking. Jake wanted to go check on them, but the walkway between the house and barn was too dangerous in these conditions. He would have to trust that the barn would hold and the animals would calm down eventually. On day 10, Jake woke up to find that the storm had not diminished at all. If anything, it seemed stronger than before. He tried to use the long-range transmitter to contact New Mesa, but the storm was blocking all signals. The radio produced nothing but static, and the emergency beacon would not punch through the interference. Jake was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with his dwindling water supply and increasingly desperate livestock. He checked on the cattle by going through the enclosed walkway that connected the house to the barn. The animals were stressed but alive, huddled together for comfort in the dim emergency lighting. Jake gave them water from his own supply, watching the gauge drop with each bucket he poured into their trough. The math was simple and brutal. At this rate, he would run out of water by day 12. The storm could last until day 14. That left 2 days with no water at all. Jake had read about dehydration during his colonial training. He knew the stages, knew what would happen to his body as it slowly shut down from lack of water. First would come the headaches and dizziness, then muscle cramps and rapid heartbeat. Eventually his organs would begin to fail, starting with the kidneys. Death would come somewhere between 3 and 5 days without water, depending on temperature and physical activity. In the sealed environment of the ranch house during a dust storm, Jake figured he might last 4 days. He went back to the house and sat by the window. Even though there was nothing to see except the opaque emergency shield, he thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment. Leaving Earth, coming to Kepler 442b, building his ranch far from the colony, giving water to a dying Yavani girl when he could not afford to spare it. Each choice had seemed right at the time, and Jake found that he did not regret any of them. If he was going to die because he saved someone's life, there were worse ways to go. On day 11, Jake filled his last cup of water. The emergency tanks were empty, drained down to the final drops. He had given most of it to the cattle, knowing they would die faster than he would without water. Some of the animals were already dead, their modified biology unable to cope with the extreme stress. Jake had dragged the bodies outside through the walkway, letting the storm bury them in red dust. He sat by the window with his cup of water and thought about Kiona. He wondered if she had made it back to her people, if she was safe in the canyon lands while the storm raged across the surface. He hoped so. It would be a terrible waste if they both died, if his sacrifice had been for nothing, but there was no way to know, and worrying about it would not change anything. Jake lifted the cup to his lips and drank slowly, savoring every drop. The water tasted like minerals and recycled sweat, but it was the most delicious thing he had ever consumed. He made it last as long as possible, taking tiny sips and letting each one sit in his mouth before swallowing. When the cup was finally empty, Jake set it down on the table and closed his eyes. The storm continued to rage outside, showing no signs of stopping. Jake's mouth was already dry again, his tongue beginning to swell. He felt the headache starting behind his eyes, the first symptom of serious dehydration. His heart was beating faster than normal, working harder to pump blood that was becoming thick and sluggish. He knew he should try to rest, to conserve energy, but sleep would not come. Instead, Jake sat by the window and listened to the storm. He thought about Montana and his great-great-grandfather who had ranched in the old American West. He thought about Earth and everything he had left behind to come to this alien planet. He thought about the cattle in the barn and the empty water tanks and the supply ship that was still weeks away. He thought about Kiona walking into the darkness, her hand over her heart, making a promise in a language he could not understand. The hours passed slowly. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, his body beginning to shut down from dehydration. In his more lucid moments, he wondered if anyone would find his body after the storm ended. Probably not for weeks or months. The colony would eventually send someone to check on him, and they would find him dried out like a piece of old leather, another casualty of the frontier. It was not the death Jake had imagined for himself, but it was not the worst death either. He had lived on his own terms, made his own choices, helped someone who needed it. That had to count for something, even if no one ever knew about it. Jake's eyes closed again, and this time he did not have the strength to open them. The storm howled outside, burying everything in red dust. Jake woke to silence. The absence of sound was so complete that for a moment he thought he had died, and this was whatever came after. But then he felt the pain, the terrible thirst that had turned his throat into sandpaper and his tongue into a swollen, useless thing that barely fit in his mouth. Dead people did not feel pain, or at least Jake hoped they did not. He was still alive somehow, though he was not sure if that was good news or bad. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids were crusted shut with dried tears and dust. He raised a trembling hand to his face and rubbed gently until he could see again. The lamp was still on, running on backup power, casting weak yellow light across his living room. Everything was covered in a thick layer of red dust that had seeped in through every microscopic gap in the house's seals. The storm had passed, Jake realized. The howling wind had stopped, and through the window he could see daylight filtering through the emergency shields. Jake tried to stand, but his legs would not support his weight. He fell back into the chair and sat there, breathing heavily, his heart racing from the minimal exertion. His body was shutting down, he knew. Without water soon he would slip into unconsciousness and never wake up. He had maybe hours left, possibly less. He thought about trying to crawl to the barn to check on the cattle, but even that seemed beyond his current abilities. Then he heard it. A sound that did not belong to the silence of the post-storm morning. A deep rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from far away but was growing steadily louder. Jake had heard that sound before, during his first year on Kepler 442b, when tensions between the colonists and the Yavani had been at their worst. The colonists called them war drums, though no one really knew what the Yavani used them for. The sound meant that a large group of Yavani were on the move, and that usually meant trouble. Jake managed to pull himself to his feet, using the chair for support. He stumbled to the window and fumbled with the controls for the emergency shields. The shield retracted slowly, revealing a landscape transformed by the storm. Red dust covered everything in drifts that reached as high as Jake's waist in some places. His utility vehicle was buried completely. The barn was still standing, but half of its roof had been torn away by the wind. And moving across this transformed landscape, emerging from the settling dust like ghosts, were people. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Jake's dehydrated brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Yavani people in traditional dress, moving in a long, organized column toward his ranch. They carried things between them, large containers balanced on poles, and at the front of the procession Jake could see a small figure that his mind insisted was Kiona, even though the distance was too great to be sure. Jake wanted to run. The colonial charter had horror stories about what happened to settlers who violated the terms of contact with the Yavani. He wanted to hide, to find a weapon, to do anything other than stand there and wait for whatever was about to happen. But his body would not obey his mind's panicked commands. He could barely stand, let alone run or fight. All he could do was watch as the Yavani surrounded his ranch. The drums stopped. In the sudden quiet, Jake could hear voices speaking in Yavani, sharp commands and responses. The front door of his ranch house opened, and Jake realized he had forgotten to lock it. Not that a lock would have stopped them if they wanted in. 3 figures entered the house. 2 of them were older Yavani men, wearing elaborate jewelry and face markings that Jake recognized from the cultural guides as signs of high status. Tribal elders, probably, or leaders of some kind. And between them was Kiona, looking healthy and strong and very much alive. Jake tried to speak, but his swollen tongue would not form words. One of the elders stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English that Jake had to concentrate hard to understand. The elder's voice was deep and formal, the kind of voice that was used to being obeyed. He said that Jake had given water when he had none to give. He said that Jake had saved the granddaughter of their chief when humans and Yavani were supposed to be enemies. He said that Jake had chosen honor over survival, and that this choice had been witnessed and remembered. Jake's vision was starting to blur at the edges, his oxygen-starved brain struggling to keep up with what was happening. He saw the Yavani begin to bring containers into his house, beautiful ceramic vessels that seemed to sweat coolness in the dry air. They were filling his water tanks, he realized. They were giving him water. He watched in disbelief as his emergency tanks, which had been bone dry for days, began to fill with clear liquid that caught the light like diamonds. One of the elders brought a cup to Jake and held it to his lips. Jake drank, and the water was different from anything he had tasted before. It was cold and clean, with a mineral sweetness that made him think of mountain springs on Earth. He drank slowly, knowing that his dehydrated body could not handle too much too fast, but it took all his willpower not to gulp the entire cup in one go. The elder spoke again. He said the water came from the deep springs, the sacred waters that had flowed since before humans came to Kepler 442b. He said the Yavani were offering this water in payment of a debt and in hope. Jake did not understand what that last part meant, but he was too focused on the water to ask for clarification. He drank another cup and then another, feeling strength slowly returning to his body. Kiona knelt beside Jake's chair and spoke in halting English that she had clearly learned since he last saw her. She told him that she had made it back to her people and told them what he had done. She told them about the broken water recycler and the empty tanks and the rancher who gave his last water to save a Yavani girl. Her grandfather, the tribal chief, had called a council meeting that lasted 2 days. There had been arguments, she said. Many of the elders did not trust humans and did not want to help one, but her grandfather had made the final decision. One act of true kindness, her grandfather had said, was worth more than 100 peace treaties. If one human could see a Yavani as a person rather than an obstacle or an enemy, then maybe there was hope for both their peoples. The tribe had packed up their precious water from springs they had kept secret from the colonists for decades, and traveled through the dust storm to reach Jake's ranch. It had been dangerous, Kiona said. 3 of their people had died in the storm, buried by the red dust they were trying to cross, but they had made it and they had brought the water. Jake listened to all of this with tears running down his face. Though whether they were from emotion or just his body's relief at being hydrated again, he could not say. He watched as the Yavani filled not just his emergency tanks but also his cattle troughs and even the bath that he had not used in weeks. They worked efficiently, moving through his ranch like they had done this 100 times before. Some of them went to the barn to check on the surviving cattle, and Jake heard them making the same clicking sounds that Kiona had made, calming the stressed animals. The elder who had first spoken stepped forward again. He placed his hand over his heart in the Yavani gesture of respect, and Jake managed to return the gesture even though his hand was shaking. The elder said that this water was a gift but also an opportunity. He said his people wanted to talk about the future, about the possibility of humans and Yavani finding a way to share this world instead of fighting over it. He said it would not be easy, and many on both sides would oppose it, but he believed it was possible. He believed it because he had seen proof that humans could choose compassion over self-interest, that they could be trusted to do the right thing even when it cost them everything. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet. He looked around his ranch house at the Yavani people who had risked their lives to save his. He thought about the 3 who had died in the storm, strangers who had given their lives so that a human rancher they had never met could live. The weight of that sacrifice settled on Jake's shoulders like a physical thing. The Yavani stayed for 3 days, helping Jake clean up the storm damage and repair what could be repaired. Jake learned that the elder who had spoken to him in English was named Nakota, and he was Kiona's grandfather and the chief of the Red Canyon tribe, one of the largest Yavani groups on Kepler 442b. Nakota had learned English decades ago, back when the first human colonists arrived, and there was still hope for peaceful cooperation between the species. That hope had died quickly, buried under misunderstandings and cultural conflicts and a few violent incidents that had poisoned relations for years. But Nakota had not forgotten his English, and now he used it to teach Jake about the Yavani way of seeing the world. They sat together in the evenings after the day's work was done, sharing meals and stories while Kiona translated when Nakota's English failed him. Jake learned that the Yavani did not see Kepler 442b as a resource to be exploited, but as a living entity that had to be respected and understood. The deep springs that the Yavani had shared with Jake were considered sacred, not because of any religious belief, but because they were the planet's lifeblood, the ancient water that had sustained life for millions of years. Jake told Nakota about Earth, about the pollution and overcrowding that had driven humanity to the stars. He tried to explain why the colonists did things the way they did, why they terraformed and built and changed things to suit human needs. It was not malice, he said. It was just the only way humans knew how to survive. They were not trying to destroy the Yavani way of life. They were just trying to build their own. Nakota listened carefully and then said something that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. He said that intention did not matter when the result was destruction. He said that humans meant well, but they were like children playing with fire, not understanding that their actions had consequences that would last for generations. The terraforming that made certain areas suitable for human agriculture had disrupted water patterns that the Yavani had relied on for centuries. The human settlements had blocked migration routes that the Yavani tribes had used to follow the seasonal rains. The mining operations had scarred the land in ways that would take thousands of years to heal. Jake had no answer to that. He knew Nakota was right. The colonial charter required environmental impact assessments, but those assessments only considered human needs. No one had asked the Yavani what they needed or how the changes would affect them. The charter acknowledged their existence but treated them as just another part of the landscape to be managed, not as people with rights and needs of their own. Kiona joined many of these evening conversations, her English improving rapidly as she practiced. She was curious about everything human, asking questions about technology and culture and why humans did things in certain ways. Jake answered as honestly as he could, trying not to make excuses or justify the things that could not be justified. He told her about the diversity of human culture, about how different groups on Earth had learned to coexist despite centuries of conflict. He told her it was possible for humans and Yavani to find common ground, but it would require both sides to change their thinking. On the fourth day, most of the Yavani prepared to leave. They had stayed longer than planned, and their own settlements needed them. But Nakota asked Jake if he would be willing to accept Yavani visitors in the future. Not permanently, he said, but regularly. Young people from the tribe who wanted to learn about human ways, and perhaps teach humans about Yavani ways in return. It would be a small start, an experiment to see if the two species could learn to understand each other. Jake agreed without hesitation. His ranch suddenly felt very empty after the Yavani left, and he found himself missing the sound of their voices and the presence of people who saw the world so differently than he did. Kiona stayed behind for an extra week, helping Jake finish the repairs and teaching him more Yavani words. Her English was now good enough for real conversations, and they talked for hours about everything from music to philosophy to what it felt like to be caught between two cultures. Kiona told Jake that many young Yavani felt trapped by tradition. They saw the human technology and wondered what it would be like to have machines that could do the hard work of survival. They saw the human settlements with their steady water supplies and climate-controlled buildings and wondered why their people insisted on living the old ways when easier options existed. But the elders said that accepting human ways meant losing Yavani identity, and identity was more important than comfort. Jake understood that conflict. He had felt similar tensions growing up on Earth, caught between the traditional values his parents held and the new realities of a changing world. He told Kiona that change was inevitable, that trying to hold on to the past exactly as it was would only lead to bitterness and loss. But he also said that change did not have to mean surrender. It was possible to adapt and evolve while still maintaining core values and identity. The trick was figuring out which parts of the old ways were essential and which parts were just habits. When Kiona finally left to return to her people, Jake felt the loss like a physical ache. She had become a friend, maybe the first real friend he had made on Kepler 442b. The other colonists kept him at arm's length because of his isolated lifestyle, and he had kept them at arm's length because he preferred solitude. But Kiona had crashed through those walls, forcing Jake to engage and connect in ways he had forgotten were possible. The supply ship arrived 2 days after Kiona left, bringing the replacement parts for Jake's water recycler, along with a message from the colonial administrator. The message asked if Jake had made contact with native populations during the storm, since satellite imagery had shown unusual activity near his ranch. Jake thought carefully about how to respond. He knew that admitting to extended contact with the Yavani could result in fines or even loss of his homestead rights. The charter was very clear about maintaining distance. In the end, Jake told the truth. He wrote a detailed report about everything that had happened, from finding Kiona near death to the arrival of the Yavani with their sacred spring water. He described the conversations with Nakota and the potential for future cooperation. He admitted that he had violated the charter but argued that the circumstances were exceptional and that the results suggested the charter itself might need to be reconsidered. The response from the colony administration was swift and angry. Jake was summoned to New Mesa for a formal hearing, facing charges of unauthorized contact with indigenous populations and violation of cultural protection protocols. The hearing took place in the colony's main administration building, with Jake standing before a panel of 3 administrators who looked at him like he had committed treason. They lectured him about the importance of the charter, about the incidents that had led to its creation, about how his actions could have endangered the entire colony if the Yavani had decided to attack instead of help. Jake listened to all of this and then asked a simple question. He asked what the administrators would have done if they had found a dying child in the desert. Would they have followed the charter and left her to die, or would they have done what any decent person would do and tried to help? The question hung in the air like smoke, and none of the administrators had a good answer. They muttered about protocols and proper procedures, and the need to contact authorities before taking action. But even they seemed to realize how hollow their words sounded. The hearing ended with a formal reprimand on Jake's record and a warning that any future violations would result in serious penalties. But Jake noticed that the warning was delivered without much conviction, and one of the administrators even admitted privately that Jake might have stumbled onto something important. The charter had kept the peace by keeping humans and Yavani separate, but it had also prevented any real understanding between the 2 species. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. Jake returned to his ranch feeling oddly hopeful. The administrators had not explicitly approved of what he had done, but they had not shut it down either. That was as close to permission as he was likely to get. When Jake returned from his week with the Red Canyon tribe, he found New Mesa in an uproar. The colonial administration had discovered his unauthorized visit to Yavani territory, and there were serious discussions about revoking his homestead rights and possibly exiling him from the colony entirely. A faction of hardline colonists had formed, demanding stricter enforcement of the charter and calling for Jake's immediate removal. They argued that his actions were encouraging dangerous fraternization that could lead to security breaches and cultural contamination. But Jake also found unexpected support. A group of younger colonists had formed a counter-movement, calling themselves the Bridge Initiative. They argued that Jake's approach represented the future of human-Yavani relations, and that the colonial charter was outdated and counterproductive. They pointed out that in 7 years of rigid separation, there had been dozens of violent incidents and zero progress toward mutual understanding. In 6 months of cultural exchange at Jake's ranch, there had been zero violence and significant progress toward cooperation. The conflict came to a head at a colony-wide meeting that lasted for hours. Jake stood before the assembled colonists and told them everything he had learned. He described the Yavani water conservation techniques that could solve many of the colony's resource problems. He talked about the deep springs and how the Yavani had managed them sustainably for centuries. He explained that the Yavani were not obstacles to human settlement, but potential partners who understood Kepler 442b in ways that humans did not. The speech did not convince everyone. Many colonists remained deeply suspicious of the Yavani and hostile to any form of cooperation. But it did convince enough people to matter. The colonial administration agreed to establish a formal cultural exchange program with strict guidelines and oversight, but also with real support and resources. Jake's ranch would serve as the initial pilot location, but other colonists would be encouraged to participate if they were willing. More importantly, the administration agreed to establish a joint Human-Yavani Council to address resource management issues. It was a small step, but it represented the first formal recognition of Yavani rights and interests in the colony's decision-making process. Nakota and 2 other tribal chiefs agreed to participate, bringing with them a wealth of knowledge about the planet's ecology and sustainable resource use. The first joint council meeting was tense and awkward. The human representatives and Yavani chiefs sat across from each other like opposing armies, speaking through translators and carefully avoiding any topics that might cause offense. But slowly, cautiously, they began to find common ground. Both sides wanted stable water supplies. Both sides wanted to avoid violent conflicts. Both sides recognized that they were stuck with each other and needed to find a way to coexist. The breakthrough came when Nakoda proposed a radical idea. Instead of humans trying to terraform Kepler 442b to match Earth conditions, what if they worked with the planet's existing ecology? The Yavani could teach humans which native plants were useful and how to cultivate them. Humans could share their technology for water purification and storage. Together, they could develop agricultural methods that produced food for both species without depleting the planet's resources. The proposal was met with resistance from both sides. Human engineers insisted that Earth crops were necessary because they were proven and reliable. Yavani traditionalists argued that changing their agricultural methods would corrupt their culture. But a younger generation on both sides saw the wisdom in Nakoda's approach. They recognized that neither species could succeed on Kepler 442b by rigidly adhering to old ways. They needed to create something new, a hybrid approach that combined the best of both worlds. Jake's ranch became the testing ground for this new approach. With help from Yavani advisors and human engineers, he converted half his land to native crops that required minimal water and no chemical inputs. The yields were initially lower than Earth crops, but they were more stable and sustainable over time. He also modified his cattle operation based on Yavani suggestions, allowing the animals to range more freely and incorporating native plants into their diet. The cattle thrived under this system, producing better quality meat while consuming less water. Other colonists began to take notice. Some were motivated by the practical benefits of Jake's methods, seeing opportunities to reduce costs and increase efficiency. Others were motivated by curiosity about the Yavani, wanting to understand these mysterious neighbors better. A few were motivated by genuine belief in the vision of human-Yavani cooperation. Whatever their reasons, the number of colonists participating in the cultural exchange program grew steadily. Kiona became a permanent resident at Jake's ranch, serving as the primary liaison between the human and Yavani communities. She taught Yavani language and culture to interested colonists while continuing to improve her own understanding of human technology and society. She had changed from the scared, dehydrated girl Jake had found in the desert into a confident young woman who could navigate both cultures with ease. Jake sometimes forgot that barely a year had passed since that first encounter. So much had changed in such a short time. The Joint Council began tackling more difficult issues. They established protocols for managing shared water resources, ensuring that both human recycling systems and Yavani deep springs were protected and maintained. They created maps showing which areas were important to Yavani migration patterns and should be avoided by human development. They developed guidelines for resolving disputes between humans and Yavani without resorting to violence. Not everything went smoothly. There were still incidents, misunderstandings that flared into conflict. A group of young colonists got drunk and vandalized a Yavani sacred site, sparking outrage and demands for punishment. A Yavani hunter accidentally shot a colonist's dog, leading to calls for retaliation. Each incident threatened to derail the fragile cooperation that had been built. And each time Jake and Kiona found themselves working frantically to prevent things from spiraling out of control. But something had fundamentally shifted. The default response to these incidents was no longer immediate hostility and calls for separation. Instead, both sides looked for ways to resolve conflicts peacefully and fairly. The Joint Council served as a forum for addressing grievances and finding solutions. Slowly, painfully, humans and Yavani were learning to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. 2 years after Jake found Kiona dying in the desert, the colonial administration formally proposed revising the charter to allow for integrated human-Yavani communities. The proposal was controversial, sparking heated debate both in New Mesa and among Yavani tribes. But it passed by a narrow margin, opening the door for a new approach to settlement on Kepler 442b. Jake watched these changes with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He had never intended to become a leader or a symbol of human-Yavani cooperation. He had just tried to do the right thing when he found a dying girl, and everything else had followed from that one simple choice. He worried that he had set in motion changes that he did not fully understand and could not control. He worried that the integration would destroy what made Yavani culture unique. He worried that he would be blamed if things went wrong. But when he shared these worries with Kiona, she laughed and told him he was thinking too much. She said that history was made by people who acted without knowing all the consequences, who made choices based on what they believed was right, rather than what was safe or convenient. She said Jake had given her people something precious, not just water for her body, but hope for her people's future. She said that was worth more than all the cattle on Kepler 442b. Jake supposed she was right. He looked out at his ranch, at the young Yavani and colonists working together in the fields, learning from each other and building something new. He thought about the girl he had found in the desert and the tribe that had returned the favor by saving his life. He thought about the simple act of sharing water and how it had rippled outward in ways he could never have predicted. He thought about his great-great-grandfather ranching in Montana, dealing with his own conflicts between settlers and native peoples, and wondered what the old man would think of what his descendant had accomplished on an alien world. The sun was setting, painting the Kepler 442b sky in those spectacular colors that still took Jake's breath away after all these years. 5 years after Jake Morrison found a dying Yavani girl near his fence line, New Mesa had transformed into something that early colonists would barely recognize. The settlement had grown into a proper city, with buildings that incorporated both human engineering and Yavani architectural principles. The streets were no longer purely human spaces but shared thoroughfares where colonists and Yavani moved freely, conducting business and building relationships that would have been impossible under the old charter. The change had not been easy or simple. There had been setbacks and conflicts and moments when it seemed like the whole experiment would collapse into violence and recrimination. 3 years earlier, a group of radical colonists had attempted to sabotage the joint water management system, believing that cooperation with the Yavani was betraying human interests. The sabotage had nearly succeeded, and several people had died in the resulting water shortage. But the incident had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened human-Yavani bonds. As Yavani and colonists worked together to repair the damage and bring the saboteurs to justice, there had also been resistance from within Yavani communities. Some tribal elders had never accepted Nakota's vision of cooperation, and they had led their tribes deeper into the canyon systems to avoid contact with humans. A few had even attacked Yavani who participated in the cultural exchange, calling them traitors and corrupted by human influence. These conflicts within Yavani society were painful and divisive, creating rifts that would take generations to heal. But despite these challenges, the overall trajectory was undeniable. More and more colonists and Yavani were choosing cooperation over conflict, finding practical benefits and genuine friendship in cross-cultural relationships. The Joint Council had expanded from 3 members on each side to 12, representing diverse communities and interests. They had established working committees on everything from water management to education to healthcare, bringing together human and Yavani experts to solve problems that neither species could handle alone. Jake's ranch remained at the center of this transformation, but it had evolved far beyond its original purpose. What had started as a simple cultural exchange program had grown into a thriving research center where humans and Yavani studied sustainable agriculture, ecology, and cross-species cooperation. Young people from both communities came to study and work, learning skills that would help build the integrated society that was slowly emerging on Kepler 442b. Kiona had become one of the most important figures in this new society. She served as the primary translator and cultural mediator for the Joint Council, but her influence extended far beyond that official role. She had written the first comprehensive guide to Yavani culture for humans, and she had helped develop the first educational curriculum that taught human and Yavani children together. She was working on a doctorate in comparative anthropology, studying how cultural integration could work while preserving what was unique and valuable in each culture. Scholars from Earth were already citing her work, recognizing that what was happening on Kepler 442b had implications for humanity's entire colonial project. Jake was immensely proud of what Kiona had become, though he was careful not to take credit for her accomplishments. She had done this herself, using her intelligence and charisma and deep understanding of both cultures. Jake had just given her water when she needed it. Everything else was her own achievement. The Joint Council had recently proposed something that would have been unthinkable under the old charter. They wanted to establish the first fully integrated settlement, a new town where humans and Yavani would live side by side from the beginning, rather than trying to integrate existing separate communities. The proposal was controversial. But polling showed that a majority of both younger colonists and younger Yavani supported the idea. They were tired of the old divisions and ready to build something new. Jake had been asked to serve on the planning committee for this new settlement, and he had reluctantly agreed. He was getting older now, feeling the weight of his years and the toll that Kepler 442b's harsh environment took on human bodies. He would have preferred to spend his remaining years quietly ranching and leaving the big decisions to younger people, but Nakota had personally requested Jake's involvement, and Jake could not refuse the old chief who had saved his life and trusted him with the future of his people. The planning process was exhausting and frustrating, full of compromises and difficult decisions. Every aspect of the new settlement had to be considered from both human and Yavani perspectives. Housing design, water systems, food production, governance structures, educational facilities, healthcare, recreation, everything required careful negotiation and creative problem-solving. There were 1,000 opportunities for the project to fail, and Jake spent many sleepless nights worrying about whether they were building something sustainable or just creating a new kind of problem. But there were also moments of genuine excitement and hope. When the committee finalized the settlement design, Jake saw something that moved him deeply. The plan showed a community that was truly integrated, not just humans and Yavani living in the same space, but working together to create something that neither species could have built alone. The water systems combined Yavani knowledge of natural hydrology with human engineering. The buildings used Yavani materials and construction techniques enhanced by human tools. The agricultural zones grew both earth crops and native plants in carefully designed complementary systems. The new settlement was named Harmony Springs, a name chosen by a committee of human and Yavani children who would be among the first residents. The name was perhaps a bit idealistic, Jake thought, but it represented what they were trying to achieve. The official opening was scheduled for 6 months in the future, and applications from both humans and Yavani far exceeded the available spaces. As the opening day approached, Jake found himself thinking more and more about that day 7 years ago, when he found Kiona dying in the desert. It had been the simplest of choices, really. Give water to someone who needed it, or follow rules that seemed less important than a human life. Jake had given the water, and in doing so he had changed the course of history for 2 species on an alien world. It seemed ridiculous when he thought about it that way. He was just a rancher, not a diplomat or a visionary leader. He had not set out to transform human-Yavani relations or create an integrated society. He had just tried to do the right thing in the moment, and everything else had followed from that one choice. It made Jake wonder how many other historical turning points had started with similarly simple decisions. One person choosing compassion over convenience and setting in motion changes they could never have imagined. The opening ceremony for Harmony Springs was attended by thousands of humans and Yavani. The colonial governor gave a speech about the importance of cooperation and mutual understanding. Nakota spoke about the Yavani prophecy of the Sky People and Earth People finding common ground. Various other officials and dignitaries said the things that officials and dignitaries always say at such events. But when it was Jake's turn to speak, he kept it simple. He told the story of finding Kiona in the desert, of making the choice to give his water even though it might cost him his life, of the Yavani tribe that returned the favor and saved him. He talked about debt and gratitude and the simple fact that kindness was the first language of civilization, no matter which planet you called home or what species you belonged to. He said that Harmony Springs existed because one girl had needed water and one rancher had chosen to give it, and because both of their peoples had recognized that small act of compassion as the beginning of something larger. Jake looked out at the crowd, at the humans and Yavani standing together, many of them friends and colleagues and partners in the work of building a shared future. He saw Kiona standing with a group of young people, both human and Yavani, who had grown up in this new integrated society and thought of it as normal rather than revolutionary. He saw Nakota, old and tired but still sharp-eyed, watching his granddaughter with obvious pride. The ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed to explore the new settlement. Jake found a quiet spot on the edge of town and sat down to watch the sunset. Kiona found him there as he had known she would and sat down beside him. They did not speak for a long time, just watching the spectacular colors paint the alien sky. Finally, Kiona broke the silence. She said that Harmony Springs was just the beginning, that there would be more integrated settlements and eventually the distinction between human and Yavani communities would become meaningless. She said her children would grow up in a world where cross-species cooperation was ordinary, where the conflicts and suspicions of the past would seem as distant and strange as the ancient wars on Earth seemed to modern humans. Jake asked if she thought they had done the right thing, if the integration was truly good for both species, or if they had simply created a different kind of problem. Kiona smiled and said that was a question for historians and philosophers, not for them. They had made choices based on what they believed was right, and now other people would make their own choices and create their own future. That was how history worked. 3 weeks after the hearing, Kiona returned to Jake's ranch with 4 other young Yavani. They arrived without warning, appearing one morning as Jake was feeding his cattle. Kiona introduced them as volunteers who wanted to learn about human ranching methods. Jake looked at the 5 young faces staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness, and he realized that Nakota was testing him. The old chief wanted to see if Jake's words about cultural exchange matched his actions. Jake set up a camp for the Yavani visitors in a level area near his barn. They refused his offer to stay in the ranch house, saying they needed to maintain their connection to the outdoors and the natural environment. Jake did not fully understand this, but he respected their wishes. He helped them construct traditional Yavani shelters, learning construction techniques that used minimal materials and worked with the planet's weather patterns instead of fighting against them. The next 2 months became a time of mutual education that changed Jake's understanding of both ranching and the planet he lived on. The young Yavani were quick learners, fascinated by human technology but also critical of its inefficiencies. They pointed out that Jake's irrigation system wasted enormous amounts of water through evaporation, and they showed him Yavani techniques for water conservation that were surprisingly effective. They questioned why his cattle ate imported earth grasses when there were native plants that could provide similar nutrition with less water requirement. They wondered why his solar panels were fixed in place when they could track the sun for better efficiency. Jake found himself defending human methods that he had never really thought about before. He had always done things a certain way, because that was how the colonial manuals said to do them. But he had never questioned whether those methods were actually the best approach for Kepler 442b. The Yavani forced him to think critically about every aspect of his operation, and sometimes he had no good answer for why things were done a particular way, but the exchange went both ways. The young Yavani were amazed by things Jake took for granted, like the ability to preserve food for months or communicate instantly across vast distances. They were particularly interested in medical technology, since Yavani medicine was limited to natural remedies and traditional healing practices. Jake spent hours explaining antibiotics and vaccines and surgical procedures, trying to make complex concepts understandable to people who had no background in human science. One of the young Yavani, a serious young man named Chaitin, had a natural gift for understanding machinery. He would watch Jake repair equipment and then ask detailed questions about how each part functioned and why it was designed that way. Within a month, Chaitin could diagnose and fix most common problems with the ranch equipment, and he started suggesting modifications that would make things work better in Kepler 442b's harsh environment. Another visitor, a young woman named Muna, became fascinated with Jake's cattle. She spent hours observing them, learning their behaviors and needs. She pointed out that the animals were stressed by the way they were confined and managed, and she suggested changes to their living arrangements that would reduce that stress. Jake was skeptical at first, but when he implemented Muna's suggestions, the cattle's health and productivity improved noticeably. Word of Jake's cultural exchange program spread through both the colony and the Yavani tribes. Some colonists were furious, calling Jake a traitor who was giving away human secrets to potential enemies. They circulated petitions demanding that the colonial administration shut down the program and punish Jake more severely for his charter violations. But other colonists were intrigued, especially the younger generation who had been born on Kepler 442b and did not carry the old prejudices from Earth. They started asking questions about the Yavani, wanting to know more about these mysterious neighbors they had been taught to avoid. On the Yavani side, the reaction was equally mixed. Some tribal elders saw the exchange as a dangerous contamination of Yavani culture, a first step toward losing their identity and becoming copies of humans. They argued that Nakota was making a terrible mistake by allowing young people to be exposed to human ways. But other elders saw opportunity. They recognized that humans were not leaving Kepler 442b, and that the Yavani needed to adapt or risk being pushed into smaller and smaller territories until they disappeared entirely. Jake found himself at the center of a cultural conflict that he had never asked for or wanted. All he had done was give water to a dying girl, and now he was somehow responsible for the future relationship between two species. The weight of that responsibility kept him awake at night, wondering if he was helping or just making things worse. What if the cultural exchange destroyed what made the Yavani unique? What if humans learned just enough about Yavani culture to exploit them more effectively? What if he was remembered not as a bridge between peoples, but as the person who started the destruction of Yavani civilization? Kiona seemed to sense his doubts. She found him one evening sitting on his porch and staring at the sunset, and she sat down beside him without asking permission. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before she spoke. She said that change was coming whether the Yavani wanted it or not. The question was whether they would be participants in that change or victims of it. She said her grandfather understood this even if other elders did not. The Yavani could either learn to work with humans or they could resist until they were overwhelmed. There was no third option. Jake asked if she was scared of losing her culture, of becoming something that was neither Yavani nor human, but some confused mixture of both. Kiona thought about that for a long time before answering. She said she was scared, but she was also excited. She said her generation of Yavani did not want to live exactly like their ancestors, following the same migration patterns and doing the same things that had been done for thousands of years. They wanted choices. They wanted to be able to take the best of Yavani wisdom and combine it with the best of human technology. They wanted to create something new. That conversation stayed with Jake as the cultural exchange program continued. He realized that he had been thinking about the situation all wrong. He had been worried about preservation, about keeping Yavani culture intact like some museum exhibit. But Kiona was right. Cultures were not static things that had to be protected from change. They were living, evolving entities that adapted and transformed over time. The question was not whether Yavani culture would change, but whether that change would happen in a way that respected Yavani agency and preserved what was most important to them. 6 months after the first group of young Yavani arrived, Jake received an invitation from Nakota to visit the Red Canyon settlement. It was unprecedented. No human had ever been invited into a Yavani home territory before. Jake knew that accepting the invitation would anger the colonial administration and possibly result in more serious charges than the reprimand he had received before. But he also knew that refusing would insult Nakota and damage the fragile trust that had been built. Jake accepted the invitation. He packed supplies for a week-long journey and set out on foot, since Nakota had specified that vehicles would not be welcome. Kiona and Chayton met him at the edge of the Red Canyon territory and guided him through a landscape that took his breath away. The canyons were not just geological formations but intricate ecosystems that the Yavani had learned to live within rather than dominate. Water flowed through hidden channels carved into the rock over millions of years. Native plants grew in sheltered spots where the sun and shade created perfect growing conditions. The Yavani settlements were built into the canyon walls, almost invisible from a distance, designed to blend with the natural environment rather than stand out from it. Jake spent a week living with the Red Canyon tribe, learning their ways and sharing his own knowledge. He met dozens of Yavani who had never seen a human up close before, and he answered hundreds of questions about human culture and technology. He also asked his own questions, learning about Yavani history and philosophy and the complex relationship they had with Kepler 442b. He began to understand that the Yavani did not see themselves as separate from their environment, but as part of it, one species among many that had evolved together over countless generations. The experience changed Jake's perspective fundamentally. He realized that humans had been approaching Kepler 442b all wrong from the beginning.